Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, how to make a knife out of a leaf spring. Now this particular knife project originated after I cut a piece of firewood that was in my backyard, and I saw kind of the cool colors and designs. Turns out that wood is probably a spalted maple. Anyway, decided to make a knife. Designed the knife, and I had a piece of spring steel in the garage. So I figured I'd use the firewood and the spring steel, and then I'd stay with that whole fire theme and actually etch some flames into the blade. So that's the materials. This is the design of the knife that I came up with, and I just kind of drew an outline of that knife onto the spring steel with a black magic marker. Now, when working with spring steel, it's very important to anneal the spring steel first. Otherwise, it's just going to be too hard. You'll go through a ton of grinding wheels, and you'll just spend way too much time. The annealing process is pretty simple. You're just going to heat it up until it is cherry red and non-magnetic. And then you're going to put it off to the side and let it cool slowly on its own. Do not quench it in oil or in water. After it's cooled, it's basically annealed, and it's much easier to work with. I'm going to cut out the whole outline of this knife with a disc grinder with a metal cutoff wheel. It's a pretty quick process. It just really doesn't take all that much time or skill. You just slowly work your way around the blade and you chop off any parts that you can possibly chop off without digging into or below the outline of the knife. Of course, after we're done, cutting out the outline of the knife and grinding the bevel on the knife and drilling the holes in the blade for the in the handle for the pins for the handle, we will then re-harden this material. I'm not going to really go into the hardening on this video, but I can just quickly tell you again: you reheat it up until it's cherry red, non-magnetic, but this time you quench it in oil. And then the only other step that you do after that is tempering, which is you put it in an oven, 375 degrees for 2 or 3 hours, and then you let it cool in the oven without opening the door overnight. So that makes sure that the blade is hard, but also not brittle. Now what I just did here is I made plunge cuts in, and then I'm going to come in from the side and then just remove as many of these little sections as possible with that cutoff wheel. Again, this goes pretty quickly, but you want to remove as much material as possible with the cutoff wheel. It'll save you time, with the disc grinder and the sanding wheel. And again, this process is pretty quick. You can probably cut out a whole knife, if you're good, within half hour, 45 minutes. I'm not saying that I'm good. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer than that. I'm just finishing cutting off some of these little sections. The sections were created just by making straight in or plunge cuts. Now, after as many of these are removed as possible, I'm just going to change that cutoff wheel to a flap sanding wheel, and I like to use a very coarse flap sanding wheel. I use a 36 or a 40, depending on which store I buy it from. This moves a lot of material very quickly, and it can go through those jagged edges left by the plunge cuts. It almost looks like a saw cut, but this sanding wheel and the disc grinder makes quick work out of it. And I'm going to actually continue around the whole outside of the knife, and I'm going to use that sanding wheel and the disc grinder really basically to shape the entire blade and handle almost to the finished outline. And of course, if you have a belt sander, you could use a belt sander to make some of the curves, or a grinding wheel, you could use a grinding wheel. But I happen to like this flap sanding wheel. So here I'm working on the inside of the handle. You just get as many of those sharp edges, ragged edges, smoothed out as possible. See the work in progress. And now I'm just finishing off the outline of the actual blade, the curvature of the blade. Now the one thing I probably should have done here, because of the spring steel, I probably should have also sanded the flat surface to get out any imperfections, any indentations, etc. I didn't do that, and when you'll see in a minute, when I finally go to do the bevel on one side of the blade, it really highlights those imperfections. So, I mean, it's not a big deal. I basically sanded it flat after I started to do the bevels, but I probably should have done it at this point. And any time now you can drill the holes through the handle for the handle pins, or the pins that hold the scales on. You just want to remember to do that before you harden the steel. As I mentioned before, you can use a grinder, you can use a belt sander to help you with any of the curves, just to get that final shape to the desired outline, or the desired shape that you want for your particular project. So this is the outline cut out, and also the original spring steel. I'm then going to mount this in what's called a bevel plunge jig. It's basically just two pieces of steel that clamp around the blade, and it prevents you from, or it makes it very easy to have bevels or plunge cuts that are even on both sides of the blade. I mount this into a bevel jig, which I clamp the blade into this, and with a bolt on the back of it, it controls the angle of the bevel. And basically you just slide this along the table, and it creates a nice uniform level bevel, and a bevel that's the same angle on both sides of the blade. I basically marked the center line of the blade, and as you're grinding the bevel, you watch that center line so that you are basically grinding an equal amount on both sides of the blade. I'm using a 1-inch belt sander for this. Now you can see right up by the towards the handle, you can see one of those little imperfections that I was talking about. The bevel is basically straight. You know, the belt sander and the bevel jig are basically holding that blade uniformly at an angle and grinding in a straight line. But because there's an imperfection or an indent in the actual material, it's kind of showing up, and it's very visual on that finished bevel. So there's making a little bit more progress on the bevel. It does take a little while. You do have to make sure that you kind of uniformly grind along the entire length of the knife. Nothing difficult here, just a little bit time consuming. Now, as I mentioned before, I eventually went over to a 4-inch belt sander to smooth out the actual flat surfaces of the spring steel. And really, I'm just sanding this till I get out all of those little indents and imperfections in the spring steel, and I just have a smooth piece of steel to work with. If you're going to make a knife out of, store-bought steel, you certainly won't have to do that. So this is the other side of the knife. I'm going to work on the bevel on the opposite side, but it is a smooth surface. Again, I've clamped the knife blade into the bevel jig, the other side of the knife blade into the bevel jig, and I'm going to slowly work on that bevel. And there you can see the jig really doing a nice job, nice straight bevel cuts. And you can control the angle that bevel jig is at just by screwing the bolt in a little bit more for steeper angles. The less the bolt protrudes out the bottom, the shallower the grind, or the shallower the angle. Now, as I mentioned before, the whole kind of theme of this knife is firewood and fire related. So Once I'm done with the bevel, I'm then going to polish the blade so that I can then add an electro etching of flames onto that blade. So I'm just going to use an oscillating sander. I started with an 80 grit, eventually it went up to 220 grit, and I really worked this a little bit just to get out any of the deep scratches, any of the grooves from that belt sander or from grinding the bevels. Everything is, pretty smooth. And after I was done with that 220, I actually sanded it a little bit by hand with a 400 grit, and then I went to an 800, and then I went to a 1400 grit paper. Sounds like a lot, but really didn't spend a whole lot of time doing it. It's a very fast process. Once you're done with the 400, unless you're seeing a deep scratch, and then you just have to go back. Either start at the 80 or start at the 220 again with the oscillating sander. But once this is all polished, I like to polish it to about a 1400. Then I can move on to the etching. And you can note that I've already drilled the holes through the handle at this time in order for the pins to attach the handle or the scales to the blade. So this is now the knife, the bevels. It has already been polished. I brought it over to my friend's shop. He heated it up with a torch until it was cherry red again. We quenched it in oil, heat treated it, and then I quenched it in my wife's oven overnight. And this is what it comes out like. It does have to be repolished after the heat treating and after the tempering, but that's a very quick process. Just right to the 1400 by hand. Very quickly it polishes almost up to a mirror again. What I'm doing now is just fitting some brass onto the blade. I'm going to attach this with 2-part epoxy as well as 2 small pins, 1/8 diameter. And now I'm going to move over onto the electro etching of the flames. Now I did an entire video that shows you this process. It's a very easy process. It just uses a 12-volt battery charger, and you really get some dynamic results with this type of etching. I'll put a link up here on for that other video. It's a short video, and it really just shows you everything that you need to know in order to etch with electricity and a little salt water almost any design into the blade of your knives. Over onto the handle, this is actually a blank which I cut out of that firewood. I did preserve it. I filled in all of the cracks, and I filled in all of the grub or wormholes, and I actually did a whole nother video just on these knife handles. I'll put a link to that up as well. But basically, I'm just going to cut out the wood at this point, and I'm going to attach these scales to the blade just like any other full tang knife. You're going to drill holes through the handles, and then you're going to attach those handles to the knife or to the blade with pins as well as 2-part epoxy, and you're going to clamp everything together, and under pressure you're going to let that dry overnight completely, so that 2-part epoxy cures completely. And then once that epoxy is cured, it can then be taken out of the clamps, and then you can start to work with it. So here's the handle, and I pre-cut it and pre-formed it a little bit, but most of the work on the handle is going to be done after it's attached to the blade. Here we've got the scales attached with the 2-part epoxy with the pins through it, and clamped in position. I'm just letting that sit overnight. Once it comes out, I'm going to go up to the belt sander. I work that handle a little bit. I carve it. I actually used a Dremel grinder. Check out that handle video that I was telling you about. And then the finished product I sand right with that same 220 grit, and then I finished it just with some cutting oil. So the knife now is basically finished. The handle is attached. It's sanded to the right shape and size and finish. The blade has that flame etching on it, and the spring steel is all hard and tempered and polished. Basically a really simple way of making a fairly nice knife with materials that you just have around the house, whether it be spring steel, firewood, etc. I hope you liked this video. I ask that you please check out our other videos on the web at www.diyeasycrafts.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching.